Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, and it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense. And here at our end of the year podcast, because we're going to go on, surprise advance alert, we're going to go on a little break at the end of the year. So this is our end of the year episode. We are ending it the way we began it, which is how you're supposed to end it. We are ending this year the way you began it, old school, the old school way, with our founding friend of the podcast, David French. David, welcome back to the Good Faith Podcast.
Thank you, Curtis. It's always good to come back. I always enjoy it.
You always have a home here. So the theme that I want to do is looking back at 2023 through the lens of humility and hope, or hope and humility. And the reason for this is because David and I, along with Russell Moore and Nancy French, David's wife, we are launching the Afterparty Project, which is trying to lead Christians towards better Christian politics. And a big move of this moving towards better Christian politics is the move from the what of politics, like the what of ideology or party or policy, to the how of politics. And the how is really anchored on spiritual values, relationships, and practices, and especially spiritual values. That Jesus is much more clear about the spiritual values we're supposed to bring into politics than about whether this ideology or that ideology is supposedly the more Christian one. So two of the key spiritual values that the Afterparty has identified as critical for a Jesus-centered view on politics are hope and humility, or humility and hope. And so what I want to do is to ask David, this is the format of the podcast, is I'm going to ask David to do a retrospective of 2023 through those two lenses, through those two spiritual values of humility and hope. We're going to do it in that order. So let's start with humility, that we are called to humility as Christians. So through that lens, David, when you look back to 2023, what took you by surprise? What was unexpected for you?
Yeah. And I'm glad you phrased it like that, Curtis, because we were originally talking about that as we talked about predictions. And it's funny, part of my humility journey is I make fewer predictions.
All right, that's smart.
Yeah. And I think it really sort of turned the corner for me around 2016, because I really did not see 2016 coming. I mean, let me put it this way. I saw Trump coming, but then I didn't see him winning. And it was only sort of in those last closing days of 2016 where I really thought, oh, wait, this thing is staying really close.
Yeah.
And so I just really kind of started to pull back from the prediction game. Although it can be fun. It also
I think that, just to interject here for a moment, I think you're making a very profound and correct biblical connection between refraining from predictions and humility. Like I think of Proverbs 27:1 says, "Do not boast." Do not boast, right? So be humble, do not boast. But what it says is, do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring. It's explicitly saying the act of prediction, especially if a confident prediction, is an act of intellectual arrogance. It is not, it's fundamentally not humble, right? So I think you're exactly right. So continue.
Yes. So I would say the thing that surprised me most is also something that surprised a lot of people, and that we're still dealing with as sort of the central fact of international life right now, even more in some ways in Russia and Ukraine, is I did not see October 7th coming. And I'm not the only one who did not see October 7th coming.
Right.
And, it just really does show how we can often, and this is something I totally did not see coming, even after a lot of my assumptions about sort of world stability had been undermined by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I was much more alert to the what was in my view a probability that Russia would attack Ukraine than I was about this Hamas attack. And what it did is it shocked us on so many different fronts. It was the fact of the attack itself, the fact that Israel proved to be vulnerable to that attack.
Yeah.
And I think that might have shocked me. That piece of it, Curtis, shocked me 10 times more than the Hamas attack. I mean, Hamas has been attacking Israel for a long time. I was shocked by the scale of the Hamas attack, but I was much more shocked that Israel wasn't ready for it. And that by itself, we have listeners who are in government, in the national security establishment. And, one of the things that should be very humbling for everyone who is in sort of this business, that we can, in fact, be lulled into a false sense of our own security. We can, in fact, be lulled into sort of a false sense of our own invulnerability. And that was much like the Yom Kippur attack in 1973, or in American history, the obviously the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7th, 1941, just shocking you out of your complacency and shocking you out of your sense of security. So far and away, that is the most shocking event of 2023 to me.
It reminds me of just how complex systems fail. And let's face it, our world is incredibly complex. Our border defense between Israel and Gaza is an incredibly complex set of issues that are, hard to unravel all of the different factors, like how much of this was the civil unrest that was already present in Israel that actually kind of made them not fully attentive to what was happening outside their borders in terms of their own sort of crisis of democracy. Anyways, it just speaks to how complex the world is, and that there's a way in which complex systems, it's a little bit like bankruptcy. So Ernest Hemingway once had this phrase. He wrote it in a novel, I think called The Sun Also Rises. And then the character says, like, how did you go bankrupt? And the answer is two ways: gradually and then suddenly. Right. Yep. Like that's sort of how bankruptcy happens. It's like you don't catch up, you don't realize the sort of slow erosion of your finances, and then suddenly there's a cascading set of events that exposes this deep underlying fragility that's been built up. And I think of nations, democracies, armed forces, like all that. There's a way in which they're so complex that they go bankrupt gradually and then suddenly. And that's probably why it's so hard to predict these things, is because the things that's actually causing sort of deep breakdowns often take years, decades to gradually build up, and you don't see it until suddenly it appears. So.
Well, that old phrase, the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Yeah.
It's got to be a really, really, really weakened camel's back
right.
for the straw to take it down. Right.
Yeah.
And so a lot of what happens is that there are the foundations rot from sort of the inside out, and an awful lot of decay is not visible.
Yeah.
And then suddenly it's just too deep and profound.
Yeah. And I think we can point to a number of other complex phenomena like the American church that we're seeing, where there's been tremendous decay that's been happening actually for decades. And now it's suddenly. All right. So David, we talked about that's complexity is a key part of this why things are hard to predict and why things can kind of catch us off guard by happening suddenly. You've talked about complexity as actually, though, recognizing complexity is a way to recognize humility, to grow our humility, is recognizing the complexity in the world. Tell me what happened in 2023 besides the attack on Israel. What else happened in 2023 that reminded you of the deep complexity that's present in the world that we often don't quite fully recognize?
Yeah. So here's something that I think is really interesting. And this is along a number of fronts, but there are some common trends that are happening throughout sort of the world of advanced economies. I'm not going to say liberal democracies, because it's not all liberal democracies, but what I would call advanced economies, once you reach a certain level of prosperity. And that is, there are worldwide really declining birth rates.
Yep.
Now, this is something that we've known about for a while, but it really sort of came to the fore much more in 2023, but also connected with some other things, Curtis, that are really interesting. Sort of worldwide, you're seeing a lot of similar maladies arising in kids, for example.
Yep.
You're seeing a lot of social problems that we fight a lot about in the United States of America that nobody is escaping. And some of these problems are arising in countries with radically different policies, very different religious cultures, very different, systems of government, very different kinds of social safety nets. I mean, sort of across a lot of the different disputes that we have, where we in the United States are at each other's throats about, well, if we just did this, then this trend that's negative will stop. Or if we just did that, and this trend that's negative will stop. And we're seeing a lot of these negative trends just persisting in various countries that are sort of trying both sides of the argument, right?
And
so
what would be some of these trends? Let's just name them. I certainly, anxiety, especially among our youth, and depression is rising,
Yes.
it's slowly rising globally across
Yes.
different cultures. That's very alarming. And Jonathan Haidt has got a very important new book coming out shortly that proposes an explanation for that. That is a lot rooted in technology, social media, and social isolation. What are some other ones that you're saying, boy, this is
rising rising anti-institutionalism and rising
Yep.
anti-establishmentarianism. So
Yep.
whether you're going to go from Argentina, and the reason, and what makes this even more complicated, for example, Curtis, is, we kind of have gotten familiar with this model that says, whether it's from Brexit or the rises of some of the right-wing parties in Central Europe, to sort of Trumpism and populism more broadly in the United States, that we've become accustomed to a kind of populist uprising against establishment forces. But where does, for example, the new Argentine president fit into that? Like, he's a reason Cato Institute libertarian, so it's not the same. It's like if Hayek got wild hair and ran for office somewhere. I mean, and so he's
talking about the economist Hayek here, not Selma Hayek.
Not Selma Hayek. That's a good. Thank you for the clarification. And so again, that's not the same playbook, right? It is in one way, sort of anti-establishment, et cetera. It's very much not in other ways. And so, but we are seeing this rising anti-establishment feeling, anti-institutionalist feeling. We are seeing increased instability around the globe, where we're talking about, it's not just Russia, Ukraine. We're talking about, Azerbaijan, Armenia. We're talking about, the continued rising concern about Taiwan, the obvious act of aggression from Hamas, this weird situation, Curtis, where Venezuela is claiming a big chunk of a neighboring country, just sort of saying that's ours. And now Brazil is sending elements of its military to, up to close to Venezuela to try to protect this other country. Where's that come from? Now, I know there's histories with all of this stuff, right? So none of this springs out of nothing, but a lot of this is coming together all at once. And so this is, again, hyper complex stuff, just hyper complex.
Well, one of the things that we also talked about, why we need to adopt humility, is one that respects the complexity of the world and how it's impossible to make confident predictions that action A will automatically lead to outcome B in that kind of way. And this is another reason why we ought to adopt humility in politics, because politics is so full of unintended consequences. That, I would say, is the one thing you can almost predict is true about any policy you predict, that you're sort of trying to ram home. And is that there's, think about the abortion debate that's been unveiling, is just like, why you get Dobbs overturned and abortion rates, well, what happens to them? They go up. So clearly there's the world is complex, and this should therefore condition the confidence and the arrogance by which we say we're right. Now, our side is right. Our policy is right, because we should all be like, boy, the world is a complex place. It is hard to figure out. To claim that, if we do X, if we get this policy passed, if my party wins, then good things will happen. That's just an extreme rejection of the humility that we need.
Right. And, it's not that we don't, it is not that we don't have ideas about a lot of this stuff.
Sure.
It's not that it's a complete, what on earth?
It's not nihilism. It's not, it's not despair. Yeah.
Right. It's, we have a lot of ideas. A lot of us have ideas. Here's here's an idea, or here, and so a lot are connected, for example, to the rise of social media, which is in smartphones, which has exploded out across the world. That's not just an American issue, and so there's a lot of sort of downstream effects of that related to algorithmic spread of knowledge, for example, and how if the algorithm consistently sort of rewards discontent and anxiety in content, well, then it makes a lot of sense that discontent and anxiety would start to be rippling outward. But that's not a complete explanation, right? I mean, and so there's also a lot of question about, so for example, when it comes to birth rates, and one of the things that those of us who are concerned about that, because it will be a world historic sea change if this continues, is, wait a minute, one of the things that those of us who are concerned about it say is people are consistently having fewer children than they say they want. And is it really the case that there's this difference between revealed preference and expressed preference?
Yeah.
And is it actually the case that what's happening is, as people have more prosperity, and along with prosperity comes choices and options and decisions that they didn't always necessarily have, that actually this is just the way people want to live when they have more choice, so a lot of this you can have explanations about, but it's so complicated and it's so immense that you have to hold a lot of these things lightly because they could be debunked or disproven, very quickly.
I think hold things lightly, but also invite more perspectives to the table. And this is what's so, this is why I believe that as Christians, we ought to at least strongly prefer liberal democracy, because at least it's the best method we've come up with to get maximum number of perspectives to the table, such that it's not just one perspective that wins and then just gets to ram everything home. Precisely because as the world is so complex, no one party, no one leader, no one party, no one policy can possibly capture all of the different dimensions. You need some process to get more perspectives on the table. And the more you have, the more chances are that you're going to actually be moving towards the truth, because again, that is the nature of complexity. One of the other things that complexity calls for, though, is learning. Because it means if it's complex, it means I don't know everything. I need to keep learning. That is the posture we need in response. And it's a deeply Christian perspective to say that's what a disciple is. Disciple literally means a learner. That's what a disciple is. So we are called to have a learning posture. David, look back on 2023. What's some new things you learned in 2023 that are notable?
Yeah, that's another really good question. It's kind of hard to pinpoint any one thing, because I think the best answer is related to the previous answer, which is the very things that have reminded me about the complexity have activated my curiosity. So I have really dived in a lot more in the last year into both the teen and especially the teen anxiety and depression, and especially the challenges of young men. So I've been kind of like drinking from a fire hose from that perspective on that in 2023. And so I've really been spending a lot of time thinking about what is and trying to consume information about American youth, and with both boys and girls, but in many ways, boys are struggling in some measurable ways that are holding them back in ways different from girls. And it's creating all kinds of downline problems. So just to take one, for example, if you have fewer boys in school at sort of every next stage, from community college to grad school, just gets increasingly women. And there's also this sort of persistent social reality that women tend to want to marry and to pair off with people who are at least as accomplished as them, sort of academically, and often more accomplished in some ways. They're sort of less likely to be drawn towards people who have maybe lower educational attainment, et cetera. And think that through on what that means for things like marriage rates, birth, next generation. there's just so much that happens when one piece of this incredible complex cultural machine starts to break.
Yeah.
And so I've been learning a lot more, and that, rolls into what I'm continuing. It's not, I don't sort of say, okay, in 2023, I'm going to learn this, and in 2024, I'm going to learn that. It's really trying to grow more every year in knowledge and wisdom and understanding of those subjects and topics that, are the things that I write about and think about.
Yeah. David, it makes me think about that particular issue of male, what you might call the marriageable male pool going down. And that term actually comes from the sociologist William Julius Wilson, who was studying trends in the African-American context back in the 80s and 90s. And his argument was that the combination of hollowing out the industrial base, removed blue-collar jobs that made Black men traditionally has made them economically stable and thus marriageable. And then also the war on drugs created this mass incarceration that further kind of sucked out so many males from African-American communities. And that so much of the struggle of African communities can be traced to just the declining pool of what he termed marriageable male. And I just think, boy, if that's happening as what you're suggesting it might be happening in the broader culture, that's something we really need to take seriously. So it does.
Yeah,
it's humbling to think about.
It's almost to the point where you would say punitive mass incarceration or family formation, pick one.
Huh.
Right.
Yeah.
In other words, like a lot of social conservatives are also very, very sort of law and order, punitive incarceration focused.
Yeah.
And have yet to fully understand and explore some of the tension between these two things. And so
like you can't actually raise a stable family if you are, promoting a policy of 3 strikes and you're out. So,
exactly. And also if you have sort of early life, long-term incarceration,
how that sets everything back. Yeah.
That the radiating effects of that are sort of obvious. Again, now makes it super complicated again, because if you say, well, I'm very much against sort of mass incarceration and really want to see substantial criminal justice reform, which I put myself in that camp after many, many long years of being in sort of leaning in the opposite direction. You also have to wrestle with that has to be done correctly. Yeah. Or you open up another can of worms, which is increased lawlessness and violence. And so there are, and I know we've talked criminal justice in the past, and there are answers for this as well. But again, it's like peeling that onion of complexity that every new layer reveals another layer. And again, that doesn't mean there aren't answers to this. Yeah. It just means that we need to have extreme humility as we approach them.
All of this, David, makes me think, because there's one way you can respond to all of this and think, we can respond with despair. Like, we'll never figure this out. We'll never figure out all of these complex problems. And it makes me think about, then putting on my theological hat for a moment, like, what is God after? Is God after us perfectly figuring things out? Or is God actually after growth? Right? And those are two different outcomes, right? One is you've solved everything, boom, you're done. Another is you're in a continual process of humility, growth, learning, right? That's kind of humility, learning, growth, right? I actually think the biblical picture of what God's intention for human beings is eternal humility, learning, and growth. Like, that is actually the picture of what human beings as stewards are meant to be. They're ever to be reflecting God's glory by growing, learning, and doing so humbly. And in some ways, again, just putting on my theological hat here for a moment, like, this work on this in this earth is preparing us for the new heavens and new earth when Jesus returns to restore all things. But that restoration isn't just like everything is locked into place and perfect in a static way. I think human beings will continue to be, even in the new heavens and new earth, involved in a process of facing complexity. It won't be broken, but it'll still be complex, and will still require learning, growth, and humility, because it's not going to be a static thing of every problem is like solved, or everything is locked into place. There's going to be continued growth. So that's another reason why we shouldn't think about all of what's happening in the world right here as something that we should be in despair about. It's, I think, an invitation for us as human beings to continue the work of becoming ever more human, reflecting God's image precisely by in humility, growing and learning. So
Yeah, I mean, I think you can drive yourself to utter despair, and history says violence.
yes, that's right. Yeah,
If you
yeah,
think
yeah.
perfection is possible.
Right. Right.
In fact, thinking perfection is possible is a sort of a utopian sort of worldview, is frequently a precursor for some pretty brutal, vicious stuff. But better is possible.
Yeah.
If you take a status quo, there is a better. There's also a worse, but there is a
Yeah.
better. And I think about the process of sanctification.
That's right.
Perfection for me is unattainable, but better is attainable.
That's right. And as a human race, as a whole collective, we are also collectively seeking sanctification. We're seeking better, like you said, not perfection in this earth, and in this until the restoration of all things. David, last question on the humility piece. This has been a big year for you. You've ascended to the heights of journalism as a columnist at the New York Times. Give our listeners, a window into, like, what's that done for your desire to continue to be humble? I would have to imagine it's a challenge to that. I mean, like you like, where do you go from here? Like, has it been like that? Or like, give us a window personally, what 2020, this kind of, breakthrough 2023 has been for you.
Yeah. So, being hired as a columnist at the Times has not been a challenge to my humility. Let me put
Okay.
Yeah, it really is not. I don't sit there mainlining my own Kool-Aid here, partly because I think we've talked about this before, but there's a lot of talented, insightful people out there, Curtis. There's a lot of and people I learn from all the time. And so I sort of have a what am I doing here sort of feeling, if that makes sense. And it's, there's a version of it that's sort of like imposter syndrome, like say,
Sure.
But really it's a ridiculous privilege. And look, I worked hard. I've worked hard in my life, but a lot of talented people work hard and have done remarkable things. So, and so I have not looked at it like that. And I have looked at it more along the lines of, this is a privilege that I should steward.
Yeah.
It's a responsibility that I need to steward. It's more people now read me than read me in any other previous place where I worked. And it's by a good bit. I mean, it's by a large number. And I feel I look at that as just a serious responsibility. And and by the way, I'll tell you, my employer looks at it as a serious responsibility as well. Otherwise, they wouldn't, surround you the way they surround me with fact checkers, very seasoned, talented editors. So when you see a column with my byline, what you need to know is that's not just me. And I think that's really important to know. And I try to tell that to people, because when someone says, I really liked your column because X or Y, there are many times that the thing that made them really like the column might have been suggested by my editor, or the response to a give and take with my editor, or some of the things that are someone might find insightful about what I've written, or a fact or a piece of information that they had not previously known. Sometimes I could say, in total honesty, who really nailed that down was Raina, my fact checker. She's the one who really nailed this one down. Or, where this sort of idea for this unique twist or turn on it, man, Chris really helped guide me through to that. So it's in a way, it's almost unfortunate that this product goes out into, well, I hate to call a column a product, but I guess it is. But this column goes out into the world, and there's one name. And I get the attention for it. I also get the blame, but I get the all the kudos when it's good, but I can guarantee you the kudos do not belong solely to me, even though my name is solely on the column. And I think just that awareness, and letting, that awareness really has helped me, even as I've been very grateful to have kind words about, some of my work at the times. I also know it's not just me, and so I think actually it has helped me quite a bit since I have been at the Times. Just the knowledge of the gravity of the responsibility that I have,
Yeah.
given the audience, is honestly, for me, it's been a very humbling thing, and it has made me lean on my colleagues, I think, in a way that I hope is healthy and makes my work better.
Let's talk about the second major spiritual value that anchors the after party, which is hope. Hope. And David, we need some hope.
Yeah.
So what were some hopeful developments that you observed in 2023?
Yeah. This is something that I've noticed, and that is, so I would say beginning, late 2015, early 2016 is a point where a lot of very, very, very smart people on a bipartisan basis sort of began to say something's wrong here. That you couldn't put the finger on it. A lot of people tried, like, there's this discontent, there's this anger, there's this anguish. We have, and we've run through a lot of these statistics in the past about, deaths of despair, et cetera, that a lot of people kind of were having the slowly dawning realization that something is wrong. Different pockets and places and pieces of the puzzle. 2023 is when I would say that I've never seen so many people from so many different vital American institutions all at once say, okay, we're concerned about our kids, we're concerned about our families, we're concerned about our culture, and we're open to ideas from outside of our bubble and outside of our cocoon. I have seen greater openness in the academy in many ways. I've seen greater openness in the NGO nonprofit world. Yeah. I just am seeing, and I know sometimes it's hard to see because a lot of this stuff is happening behind the scenes, but I can tell you I'm involved with a lot of different initiatives with people ranging from pretty far to the right to really far to the left, where there is a lot of fellowship and community and communication in good faith about what to do. And I think that is incredibly hopeful. I was actually asked this very question, by somebody middle of the year, because we were talking about all the grim stuff that's going on. And she said, what gives you hope? And I said, well, one thing that gives me hope is some of the smartest people in the world who I respect the most are fully aware of all of these problems and are diving in good faith. Some of those brilliant minds, some of the most articulate, communicators are really understanding what we're dealing with here. Yeah. And I think that absolutely gives me hope. When you have something come up like we've seen since October 7th, and the incredible challenge on campuses that we have seen, and some of the ideas for responses coming from across the political spectrum are brilliant, and people are beginning to crack open their hearts to them, even from unconventional sources. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I definitely see that, Curtis, in this country.
David, and would you say that I think we can lose hope if we get overly preoccupied on national politics and on Congress? Because what you're describing is not happening in Congress. It does not seem like it doesn't seem
nothing
to
I said applies to anyone but a small handful of members of Congress or the Senate. Yeah,
right. But because that's what grabs all the headlines, and the battle for the White House and Supreme Court rulings, right? That's what gets the headlines. But that we miss then sort of these green shoots of hope of, open-mindedness, of actually connecting across partisan or ideological divides that actually happen in other sectors, the academy, private sector, the other civic sectors, and so forth, perhaps more on the local levels. That part of what nourishes us, at least hope in terms of temporal developments, and these are just temporal world, developments in our human life, is that if we are trying to build our hope at that level, which we do need to, it's to kind of take off our preoccupation with the national and look for other or national and the national partisan world, but also look into other corners where there actually are more encouraging developments.
Yeah. And, I could have just said everything that I said so much shorter and more concisely, Curtis. So I'm going to do it.
Okay.
I'm reminded of Edmund Burke when he's talking about the little platoons of society. Yeah. And what you said just triggered little platoons. A lot of little platoons are activating. Yeah. We saw a situation, not all little platoons are activating politically, but we saw a situation here in Franklin when we had this mayoral candidate who for a while appeared like she was going to win. And she was, I don't think it's too strong to say she was a Nazi sympathizer, like an actual
that's right.
Nazi sympathizer. And the little platoons activated and really broke through a lot of political barriers to activate, because there were a lot of people, because she had so firmly aligned herself with sort of the MAGA world, that it took a lot to break through to neighbors who were sort of MAGA friendly or MAGA neighbors that no, this is something, truly out of bounds in a way that we've not seen in our lifetimes in local politics and all of this. And she went from, arguably being the favorite to losing 80-20 roughly. That was a political little platoon, but the little platoons I'm mainly talking about are not political at all. I can't tell you how many times I've participated just in the last year to 18 months of these conversations across differences in small spaces and small places that are happening around the country. So there's a lot of darkness, but the little platoons are activating. Or as Alexis de Tocqueville said, all the way back, what do Americans do when they have a problem? They form associations. And we formed one, Curtis, the Afterparty.
That's right. That's
one of the little platoons.
It's a little platoon. We're hoping to grow this little platoon and recruit more members to it. And if you want to join, go to afterparty.org. That's after-party.org. It is, for me, definitely one of the hopeful little platoons that I hope is growing bigger, that we hope to be a conveyor of hope in 2024. David, I want to talk about the Christian world, the church, because we on this Good Faith podcast have talked a lot about some of the discouraging developments, like the hijacking of the church by parts of the church by the far right. We're going to have a podcast interview. I interviewed Tim Alberta, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. That book is already out. If you haven't gotten it, go and read it. And I have an interview with him coming out in January, but he describes this process. So there's a lot of things. There's the abuse, the wave of abuse scandals and cover-ups of that abuse that have swept through the church. A lot of discouraging things. But David, what are some hopeful developments that as you looked at 2023, what are some hopeful developments within the church that are notable to you?
I got a pretty easy answer to that one, Curtis.
All right.
Asbury.
Yeah. We talked about this. That's right.
Yes, we talked about it. We had Asbury, we talked to Asbury officials. We talked about it. We talked to Asbury folks. And this is months and months ago, but for the listeners who may not remember what happened, this Asbury College is a small college in Kentucky, not far from where I grew up, and it had a revival. And Asbury is actually known for its revivals. But it had a revival, and it was in the form of, I believe, of a chapel service that just basically never seemed to end. That the students were responding in worship and in faith and in repentance so profoundly that it just kept going. And then people began to arrive from around the country hungry for this experience. And this wasn't something that was gimmicky. It wasn't some sort of light show. It wasn't like healing miracle time. It wasn't that. It was humility, prayer, worship, reconciliation, love. And it didn't just encourage me, Curtis, that it happened. It also encouraged me in the wisdom of the people who were leading the college.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because when something like this happens in American Christianity, there's two things that happen at once. There's one segment of people who are truly drawn to it because of urgent spiritual need.
Mm-hmm.
And then also
the entrepreneurs come out.
Here come the spiritual entrepreneurs. Here comes the dollar signs. Here comes. And so, there's a lot of people who, when thousands of people are wanting to come to a place, say, let's just roll with this thing. Right.
Yeah.
And the leaders of the college not only kept it contained, in other words, they were wise enough to really prioritize the student experience here, not the traveling bus tour experience.
Yeah.
And then eventually just said, okay, it's time. It's time for the students to go back to class. It's time, to sort of resume the normal activities of the college. I just think there was so much wisdom displayed to not be blown and tossed by the drama of the moment, but to sort of say, who are we? We're an educational institution. What is our mission? What is our purpose? How are we going to shepherd this moment? This is a teaching moment. It's not just an experiential moment. It's a teaching moment. So honestly, Curtis, we've had a lot of examples of institutional failure that we've talked about.
Yeah.
I was frankly just in awe, honestly, of the whole phenomenon, the whole thing.
I encourage listeners to check out the podcast we did with Kevin Brown and David and I talking. I talked with Kevin Brown, and then David and I talked more about just how impressed we were by that, and also how revivals, the real hope of it is actually what happens 5, 10, 15 years from that, especially from the friendships and relationships that are formed in kind of that hot fire, the revival, that it actually creates a more of like a steel bond that sustains people over time. And I'll put it in the show notes, our episode. I really enjoyed that conversation. David, I've got my own version of a hopeful development in the church, which may sound a little counterintuitive. Here's mine. Mine is smaller churches. Smaller churches. Yeah, because now that's often taken a sign of despair or a sign of of bad things happening. Of course, if you look at any of the statistics, the average sizes of the churches are getting smaller. People are leaving churches, and pastors are having to deal with the fact that their numbers are going down. Now, why do I say that is an actually hopeful sign? Because, David, at the end of the day, the role of the pastor and the role of a church, it is not to grow a bigger church, a bigger local church. Mm-hmm. The role is to make disciples. That is the Great Commission, to make disciples. In other words, to form people as Christ followers, bearing the likeness, and the life and values and practices of Jesus. We're supposed to be forming people like Jesus. And the question that we have to ask, that we have not confronted seriously, is, does the business model of the American church, which is all about growth and size and a large church, is that actually forming people? Not does it grow the numbers, but is it actually forming people? Is it discipling people? And I think what all of the rise of the Christian nationalism, the vaccine, the conspiracy theories, the abuse scandals, all that is showing us that actually formation it's the thread that connects all of them is they're all essentially failures of Christian formation. There's specific issues that made that each of those kinds of attacked, but the underlying weakness is we didn't form our people to be Christ followers especially when it gets hard, which is really when you find out when you've actually formed people. And I think this is I'm hearing more and more conversations happening within ministry circles, starting to recognize this is a day of reckoning of our model of formation. We need a different and better model of formation rather than the standard David, what you and I have talked about as
Mhm.
the TED Talk plus Coldplay concert method of spiritual formation, right? That's
Right.
which is the big program, the big splashy talk, big splashy concert, worship concert, and somehow we think rolling that out every Sunday morning is actually forming people deeply. It's not. It's really not doing that. And I'm starting to hear more and more talk within Christian ministry circles, sort of like in the way that you're just talking about in the policy world or the idea world, in the Christian world, starting to reckon with that. And I think I am hopeful that we are going to see a renaissance of, at least, again, probably in little platoons, in the Christian version of little platoons, little versions and trials and experiments, to start finding our way to something other than the TED Talk plus Coldplay concert model of spiritual formation. What do you think of that?
I'm glad you said that. I think there has been for such a long time this emphasis on how do we know God is moving? Look at the vast crowds. Look at the crowds. And, we sort of forget, like, Jesus sometimes walked away from the crowd.
He very explicitly did so. Yeah, that's right.
Very explicitly. One time, he has a crowd in front of him eating out of the palm of his hand, so to speak. And then he goes, you know what? This is great and all, but unless you can eat my flesh
right.
and drink my blood, you cannot enter the. And they're like, wait, what? Cannibalism or what? And he doesn't explain.
Yeah.
Everyone leaves.
It was a bad TED Talk, David. It was a very bad TED Talk.
Imagine ending your sermon with a word so challenging that basically before the final song, everyone's just already out of there.
Right.
And you have a meaning that's really profound and in the fullness of time is to be revealed, but you don't give it. You don't give it then. You turn to your ministry staff and you go, hey, y'all leaving too? And that's like, and so time and time and time again in scripture, you see the emphasis not on the numbers, not on the vast numbers. That's not to say that numbers never sort of matter, and because there are moments in scripture where large numbers of people engage in repentance, right? Large numbers of people respond. But you cannot draw a through line that says big groups of believers equal good.
Yeah.
That's not the through line. And so we had gotten so deep into that, just so deep into that. God is moving. How do I know God is moving? Lots of people are there. So then what do? You start doing the things that bring lots of people to something. Right. And then that therefore means God is moving. And I think we've begun to see the problem with that. There's not, when the core thrust is what can we do to bring more people in and to keep that growth model, you're going to leave a ton of spiritual formation on the floor because it's just too challenging.
It's too challenging, and you are taking your cues from the sheep. You're following the sheep. You're not actually shepherding the sheep. You're saying, what do the sheep want so that I can actually provide it for them? And this, again, is where I think a lot of the political hijacking has taken place, is simply that it's shepherds who are weak shepherds, false shepherds, saying, what red meat can I feed the sheep in order to draw them to my flock, rather than how do I form them? How do I lead them, even if it means going down a difficult path? All right, David, I have talked to so many Christians who have expressed to me a sense of anxiety and hopelessness as they think about 2024 because of the election year. So because we are calling people to hope, how do we call people to hope when they are looking at the election season and just feeling despair and hopelessness? What is your word to those people about why they are invited to hope, which is a pillar of the after party?
Yeah. Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat anything about 2024. I have concerns. I'm just going to say it right out, Curtis. This is the first election of my lifetime that I'm not 100% sure America will survive.
That's right.
Now, I am almost certainly sure. I am pretty darn sure, however you want to say it. Like, I am expecting it to survive no matter what. I am extremely optimistic that it will survive, but I've never had that thought enter my mind before. Yeah. That, wait, could we not survive it?
Yeah.
Maybe. Okay, so that's not telling people to be hopeful.
But it
But
is actually, David, I think it is. It is actually calling them to be truly hopeful, right?
right.
Because here's the thing. We would critique, you and I would critique Christian nationalism as saying, ultimately, one way we would critique it is you're pinning your hopes on a particular version of America, right? Now, that version is like 1950s America, where white Christians have the dominant social and cultural status. And we're saying that's a false hope, to pin your hopes in God, that God's purposes is still going forward in the world, that God is sovereign in the world. You're pinning that, you're equating that with a particular version of America, which we would say should not be. Now, in the same way, I would say those who are still committed to democracy, like you and I, our temptation, like if we're going to, again, go back to humility and take the log out of our own eye here, right? Our
Yeah.
temptation is we want to pin our hopes not on God and God's kingdom that transcends all human versions of the kingdom, but we are still in some way pinning our hope on a version of America. It's not the Christian nationalist version of America. It's the liberal democratic version of America. And even though I think, have a strong case to make that version of America, a liberal democratic version, is in closer partnership with Christianity, it's not to be equated. It's not to be pinned together and fused together. And so we can be hopeful, because even, David, let's say it's a 5% chance that America as a liberal democracy does not survive 2024. That very possibility should cause us to ask, wait, what is my ultimate hopes on? Is my ultimately hopes pinned on America as liberal democracy? And if so, how different ultimately is that than the Christian nationalist version? It's just a different version, right? We may say it's a better version, but it's still a human version. And we have to realize, wait a minute, our hope is in the kingdom to come. That's why we called our project The Afterparty. That's the wedding feast of the Lamb, when Jesus returns to this earth and establishes his kingdom fully and completely. And that's our ultimate hope. So the Christianity, the church, the movement of Jesus, it outlasts human kingdoms. It's done so, and it outlasted the Roman Empire. It outlasted medieval feudalism. It outlasted all the versions that it was, kind of loosely attached to, or even strongly attached to. When its partner model collapsed, God still carried forth his purposes. Like, look at communist China. That's where the church is growing the fastest, right? So the fact that we may not be as confident about liberal democracy in America surviving 2024, that's actually an invitation to actually discern where our true hopes lie.
Well, and also, I've used this term, I've talked about this before. In the movie Ted Lasso, the show Ted Lasso, it's considered beneficial to have the memory of a goldfish, which is you forget your last bad play and you just press on.
Right.
But we have too much of a goldfish memory because what we end up doing is we think, the bottom line is, Christians in America have been living with world historic levels of power and privilege and liberty for a long time.
Just off the charts.
Off the charts. Now, not a long time in the sweep of world history, but in a long time sort of relative to American history, Christians have enjoyed this just an immense amount of liberty, an immense amount of prosperity, an immense amount of power by the standards of human history. And so this idea that we're entitled for that to continue indefinitely, really? No. We might be the generation that sees some sort of fracturing, but it is not a fracturing that would surprise God, and it is not a fracturing that would shock in generations of our spiritual forebears.
That's right.
So we just need to have that perspective.
And church history tells us when that fracture happens, there's painful, there's loss for sure. There's also opportunities and growth and creative outpourings of the Holy Spirit that come forth as people have to invent new things, new models, new expressions, like a model of spiritual formation other than the standard one that we've been operating with throughout. So we should approach even the fragility that we all realistically should feel about 2024 in our political system, with a reminder that our hope is not in any human construct of a political system, even as beneficial as one may be, such as liberal democracy is. It's not our ultimate hope. Our ultimate hope is not in that. Our ultimate hope is in Jesus, the King of Kings, who will bring his kingdom into fulfillment in the end. We know how the story ends. And that really is the message of the after party. And it's why we call the after party. It's what
Right.
comes after all of the human hopes as expressed in fallen human parties finally give way to the only thing that actually will last. Now, David, now this is just like free for all random questions here, where I'm just going to ask you some random favorites of yours from 2023. Are you ready?
I am ready. I am ready.
Okay. 2023 best sports event.
The best sports event of 2023 is going to be one that like nobody is going to say, but I'm going to say it because it's part of my long running argument, Curtis, over who is the GOAT. It's when LeBron passed Kareem for highest scoring basketball player in history. For several reasons, that was my favorite sporting event of the year.
Wait, are you saying that is what established LeBron as the GOAT over Michael Jordan?
It's another brick in the impenetrable.
Oh my God!
Impenetrable
All right, this is
wall
where the podcast goes off the rails. Okay.
But yeah, it was that event, and partly because I'm actually a quite big LeBron fan, haven't always been, but it was really a fun thing on a number of counts. One, it gave me another argument for my case for LeBron as the GOAT. I think maybe that could be my magnum
I'm showing
opus.
incredible restraint right now, listeners.
I know.
I'm just showing.
I know.
I'm showing incredible restraint.
But I also love the way the NBA pays respects to the people who built the sport. Yeah. And so the sort of the honor given to the people who came before and the people.
That's right. It knows its history. Yeah.
Knows its history. The players know their history. And the other thing is, here's what's fun about this. Okay, so LeBron grows up in a tough circumstance. His father isn't around. He's got, single mom raises him in a tough place. And he's anointed by age 16 or so as the new king, the coming king of basketball.
Yeah.
And then by the time he turns 18, it's as if somebody backs up a dump truck full of money and just dumps it on an 18-year-old. Just dumps it on. I mean, money that I cannot fathom is just dumped on him. I had a great upbringing, wonderful parents. You dump that amount of money on me at age 18, and it's 50-50 whether I wind up in a ditch somewhere like 9 months later. I mean, so he goes through this career. He marries his high school sweetheart. By every indication, he's just a wonderful and devoted father. He starts a school for kids who are struggling in his hometown. The only scandals he has are related to, should he gone to Miami?
Yeah.
Or do people not like his politics? Well, I'm sorry. That's not a scandal if you don't like LeBron's politics, okay? He's entitled to his views.
No, he has handled himself with remarkable honor, discipline, integrity all down the line. Absolutely.
So I just I'm enjoying watching this all play out. Yeah. Seeing him win the MVP of the NBA in-season tournament in his 21st season.
Did he turn it on? My goodness.
Yeah.
All right.
Between him and Tom Brady. I just felt privileged to see these two historic great athletes.
That's true.
In the twilight of their careers, still so good. So that's my favorite thing of 2023.
All right, David, favorite book you read in 2023?
That is a great question. And I'm still not sure what my favorite book is. In part because I've got into this habit now where I'm just almost exclusively reading military history. So it feels a little weird to say.
You're like me growing up. That's all I read growing up. But I've sort of learned to diversify a little bit.
Yeah, I know.
You're regressing.
Oh, it's terrible. It's terrible. No, so it feels weird to say, well, the third book I read this year about World War I was the book of the year for me. That's a little bit difficult to say. But I will say that there is a book that I'm reading that is not new to this year that I just started reading, which is really interesting to me. Now, I will tell you that there are a couple of books, that I think are very much right in our wheelhouse about this moment in time that I think people should read. And one is by our friend Russell Moore, Losing Our Religion, which really is an exhortation, also part of his own story. It's about what is happening in evangelicalism, and a great companion to that is Tim Alberta's book.
Yep, we talked about
That is, the kingdom, the
that.
power,
The
and the
power and the
glory.
glory. Yeah.
It is a very, very, very good book. Really, both of them are really explaining to people who have not lived it on this day-to-day granular basis the way we have, like what's going on.
Yeah.
All
right.
I'm also, I have another one.
All right, go ahead. Keep going.
One. It's super fast. And
you're stretching the definition of best, but go ahead.
I'm sorry. But this one is, I've just started it because this
All
would
right.
be best. And it's a book from several years ago, and it's called The Sin of Certainty. And it's by a guy named Peter Enns. I know he's been controversial in some ways, but interestingly, it's sort of wheelhouse to what we talk about. And now the argument isn't that certainty is always a sin, but there is a sin of certainty. And it's actually quite, in many ways, inspiring, and in many ways quite challenging. And I'm not all the way through it, but it's really good.
All right. Okay, David, best meal you had in 2023. Do you remember a particularly outstanding meal you had?
I am not a foodie.
Okay.
But the best food moment occurred when I went to a hot chicken restaurant called Hattie B's. It's a little chain.
Yes, that's a Nashville institution.
It's a Nashville institution. And believe it or not, I'd never been, because Curtis, I cast aspersions on this whole Nashville hot chicken thing. Because old school, if you were going to say, what's a special Nashville restaurant, you would say, oh, it's a meat and three. A meat and three is Nashville. And then hot chicken is the touristy thing, right? So I've kind of cast aspersions. But Naomi, my youngest, loves Hattie B's. Never been. Took her to Hattie B's on her birthday. And rarely have I had just a first bite of something and been so pleasantly surprised.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
Yeah.
I love fried chicken. So my next trip out there to see you, that's a stop. David, I got two more for you. What is the favorite column you wrote that you particularly have a lot of pride in?
Yeah, my favorite column, and as soon as I saw it, you sent that to me earlier, and as soon as I saw it, I was, I know the answer to that right off the top of my head. And it's the piece that I wrote about The Bear, the TV show The Bear. And it's called The Bear and the Need for a Place to Belong. And the reason why it's because, number one, the show hit me hard. I mean, that show hit me hard, and I haven't stopped thinking about it since I saw it. And number two, I feel like in that column, we were able to really communicate the thing about the show that made me love it so much. And and the thing about it was, you take a bunch of people who are all dealing with their own challenges, and you put them in a place where they are seen for who they can truly be, and they are seen for all the potential that is within them. And they are treated as if they are people of potential, not in a cheesy, schmaltzy way, right? Yep. But there's a lot of swearing. There's a lot of conflict. There's a lot of ups and downs. But the bottom line is, the beauty of the show is how it shows each person as a person of potential, and how that little restaurant, The Bear, is a place where they belong and they are seen in that way. Yep. And I just thought, when I saw it, every one of us needs that place. Yeah. We all need it. And it just impacted me so strongly. And I tried to communicate that in my column, and it is the column that more people talk to me about than anything else I wrote. Oh,
interesting. Yeah, I think that's right. It's something that's fundamentally human. It's what the church is supposed to be. It's what families are supposed to be. It's what small towns are supposed to be, because that's what it means to be human. It's what we talked about earlier, is that we are made in the image of God, which means God is constantly wanting to grow us, to learn, because we have a future in actually ordering, responsibly be caring for this world. He wants us to kind of be his partners in taking care of the world. And so we need to be growing up into that. We need to realize the God-given potential each one of us has for that. I agree with you. We've made it through season 1, and it is a great picture, I think.
Season
of what
2 is when it really pops.
All right, very
man.
good.
Yeah,
Excellent.
season 2. Yeah.
Well, you already answered then my last question, which was going to be most enjoyable TV show. So I think that wraps up our quick hitting recap of 2023. We also have some hard, challenging news about kind of what personally, David, you and your family are facing. Do you want to take a moment to share with our listeners?
Yeah. Nancy, my wife, Nancy, shared this on Twitter earlier this week. And this is something we've been dealing with since a couple of weeks before Thanksgiving. But she was diagnosed with an aggressive form of breast cancer. It's called triple negative breast cancer. Some listeners will no doubt know what that means. She has started chemo. We trust God. We've got chemo ahead of us for 6 months. We've got surgery ahead of us, might have radiation ahead of us. It's an aggressive cancer. It was caught early, thankfully. So we have much reason to hope and also much reason to be sobered by the challenge ahead. And Nancy is, as I said, we trust God. Nancy is trusting God. She is resolved. And, it's just, it came out of nowhere. She's been the healthiest person in the whole family, our whole marriage, and found a lump. 2 days later, there's a mammogram, and she had been doing regular mammograms. 2 days later, there's a mammogram. 3 days after that, there's a biopsy. 2 days after that, there's a diagnosis, and then the whole world changes. And we know a lot of listeners have experienced that, and that's what we're walking through right now.
Well, we do really just grieve the struggle of that with Nancy, and invite all of our listeners to join us in regular prayer and intercession for her healing, for just making the perseverance, endurance she's going to need to make it through the slog of chemo. So please join us as a community of listeners to be praying for Nancy. David, is there anything else that people, if they feel that urge, like people who know about Nancy or just care about your family, what else can they do that might just be to express support?
Yeah. Prayer and people have been sending us emails and notes, and Nancy has read them all. I have read them all. We appreciate it so much. And, we had, Curtis, in 2020, the giant challenge of late term diagnosis of very severe birth defects with our granddaughter, Lila. And I can't even begin to describe how much it meant that people, and we kept this news to ourselves for a really long time. And then in sort of the final stages of pregnancy, we put it out there that this was happening. And I have to say, my favorite message came from a mutual friend who's an atheist. And he said, I am praying to the God you believe in for Lila. And he said, do you think God hears that prayer? And I said, 100%. And that's so, right. Prayer matters. It really does. Kindness matters. And a lot of people know, listeners know sort of our history of the last 8 years. We have not always confronted a lot of kindness over these last 8 years. And I can tell you the kindness that we've experienced in the last 2 days is like encountering an oasis in the desert. It has just been such a blessing.
Well, again, good faith listeners, let's really be showering our kindness and especially our prayers for Nancy French in these next months. David, thank you for sharing. Thank you for reflecting with me back on 2023 through the lens of humility and hope. Listeners, we're bringing 2023 to a close. So we're going to take the next several weeks off. We'll be coming back to you in early January with resuming things. So until then, have a blessed Advent, and we will once again see you around the campfire.